Hello, thank you for joining us. We'll get started in just a few minutes. Hello, thank you for joining us. We'll get started at the top of the hour. Make sure to say hello in the chat feature and tell us where you're joining from. Hello, and thank you for joining today's webinar. We are ready to begin. Today's webinar is part of the Nursing Faculty Prep webinar series sponsored by Lecturio. Today's webinar is eligible for 1 contact hour. Sigma Theta Tau International Honor Society of Nursing is accredited as a provider of nursing continuing professional development by the American Nurses Credentialing Center's Commission on Accreditation. The speakers and planning committee members have disclosed no relevant financial relationships. To receive contact hours for this NCPD session, participants are required to attend the webinar and complete an evaluation form with instructions that will be emailed to all attendees 1 week after the webinar. This webinar is being recorded and will be available via the Sigma repository within a few business days of recording. Following the presentation, if we have time, we'll have a question and answer session. You'll see on your Zoom webinar control panel that you can send a message through the Q&A feature. This is where you can type in any question you'd like to pose to the presenter. Be sure to hit send so the message makes it to us. Please use the Q&A feature for questions and the chat feature to interact with other participants. This webinar is proudly sponsored by Lecturio. Lecturio's products and services help nursing students learn to study effectively while empowering educators with valuable and actionable performance insights. Discover how Lecturio can enhance your teaching by visiting their website, lecturio.com/sigma. We'd like to thank our speaker for sharing their expertise with us today. Our speaker today is Dr. Colleen Maycott. Dr. Maycott has been engaged in teaching at the undergraduate level for the last 25 years. Her scholarly and academic background is grounded in caring sciences as a lens to ensure humanistic nursing education and research. Her expertise is in curriculum development, implementation, and evaluation to ensure nursing students' practice is safe, competent, ethical, and compassionate. Her own learning as of late has centered on unpacking and challenging her own white settler privilege, engaging in critical reflexivity as the birthplace for richer dialogue and perspectives, and championing nursing theory and philosophy as the foundational language and lens to advance the discipline and inform the profession. She has been a member of Sigma since 2007, serving both the local chapter and membership on international committees. She is committed to Sigma as a nursing organization that provides necessary education, leadership, and scholarship for the discipline and profession to transform. We're so thankful to have you today, and we're going to turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you, and welcome to everyone who's joined from around the world. As a Canadian and as a nursing professional, it is my opportunity to provide a land acknowledgement to situate my own learning and my ability to engage in treaty rights. I stand humbly before you as a white settler in Treaty 6, a traditional meeting grounds, gathering place, and traveling route for the Cree, Saulteaux, Blackfoot, Métis, Dene, and Nakota Sioux on Turtle Island. I recognize and own the privilege afforded to me by my birth and ancestors, and realize that it was acquired as a result of broken treaties of friendship. I am of Polish, Irish, and French ancestry with a strong farming background, which also has respected and had a relationship with the land. My French roots date back to 1663 in Canada, and as a result, colonization is deeply embedded in my DNA. I am engaged in creating brave spaces for reciprocal learnings to disrupt dominant narratives which omit and or erase historical and current trauma, including residential schools, the 60 Scoop, missing murdered Indigenous women and children. I will not be silent or complacent as my fellow Canadians are dehumanized. I am dedicated to shifting from an individual focus to a consciousness of the collective, to foster respect for all voices. I pledge to engage in unlearning, to relearn, to rebuild a just and inclusive and diverse society, which becomes the best expression of what it means to be human, and as a citizen to uphold treaty rights in Canada and globally. I have been part of the problem historically, but I'm choosing to be part of the solution as an ally, accomplice, and co-resistor by upholding social justice, by teaching the truths of colonization and the consequences of systemic discrimination, which continue to disenfranchise the first of this land as well as elsewhere in the world. Next slide. So I'm not going to go over the learning intentions. My intention really is to provide some concepts, to provide a case study that we can work through, and just to facilitate a discussion about perhaps what are some of the things that are challenges in nursing education that we really need to address. So I'm going to highlight a few system concepts that would be beneficial as educators to facilitate nursing education and language for students. Next slide. So when we look at the clinical decision-making model, which is very familiar to many of us who realize that our students need to take the NCLEX, all models or algorithms or protocols have strengths. They provide synthesis, they take all of the evidence that is existing and provide it in a simple format. It's an easier process. This certainly is beneficial for novice clinicians who don't have to go to the literature. The literature has been brought to them, so they can go through and be guided in their nursing care. And faculty members can use models and protocols to guide critical thinking for students. It provides standardization, so the guesswork is taken out and people should be treated the same. However, there are challenges when we think about evidence. What evidence was included in the protocol or the model, and what evidence is omitted? Whose voice perhaps is not heard? Especially for novice, it can become very inflexible way of acquiring your nursing practice as you feel like you have to follow the protocol. So innovation and creativity is usually encouraged and increased with our own experience. And if we treat people and try to fit people into protocols and not see their uniqueness, we do run the risk of having dehumanization. Next slide, please. So one of the movements around the world is person-centered care. And again, strengths and challenges. When we put the person at the center of their care, we create an opportunity to hear their voice, to hear their desires, their wants, and hopefully, if the nurse and the team is open, we can provide very unique care, so care that is tailored to what is in their best interest. It comes from a capacity building perspective, so we don't see people as deficits or things that are wrong with them. What we see is their strengths and work with those strengths. So it's a very empowering model. I think some of the challenge is that sometimes we don't address our own inherent power as nurses. So because we are nurses, we have power over, as educators, we have power over our students because we're the ones who are determining how they're going to be evaluated. So as nurses, whether we're as faculty members or whether we're out as clinicians, we have to address that power differential. And sometimes if our values and beliefs don't align, so the nurse educator, nurse faculty member, clinician with the student or the patient, then patient-centered care is not going to work or student-centered care is not going to work. Diversity, whether it's equity, diversity, and inclusion in Canada, or diversity, equity, inclusion in the US, there is lots of literature out there about the importance of diversity, but we don't see a lot of action. So if we are just going to read about diversity, but we're not going to operationalize it, it becomes a challenge to have student-centered nursing education or person-centered care. And I think if anything that COVID has taught us is that we're living in a very fractured world. We have fractured systems. COVID really demonstrated this in terms of healthcare. So if person-centered or student-centered care focus is going to work, we need to have education, healthcare, policing, law, social services, all working together to see the uniqueness of each individual, whether they're patient or student. And then I think when we think about patients, oftentimes we are very siloed into thinking that patients have choice. And for those of you who have been reading a lot about EDI or diversity, we know that choice is something that is a privilege, and not everybody will have choice or feel that they can take that choice, and students included. So students have a history and they come to us with that history. So we need to understand some of their experiences. I have students who don't talk in my classroom because they came from classrooms or learning experience where they were told that that was disrespectful to ask questions or to challenge, the professor or the instructor. I have a classroom that I want to be challenged because that's the only way I can grow. So we have to think about this fractured system. Do we want people to be seen as unique? Do we want people to have choice and encourage choice? So these are some ideas and questions that I'm going to leave with you because we all have different perspectives and lived experiences, and priorities as to what is important in nursing education. Next slide, please. So one of the concepts that was introduced to me probably about 10 or 15 years ago was intersectionality. So it might be very familiar to many of you, but intersectionality gives us an opportunity to understand who we are in relationship with. So this intersectionality concept was created by Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989 as a way to look at how discrimination is not just one isolated incident, but it's layers and layers of insults and abuse. So when you look at the graphic here on your screen, you can see who each one of us is the white circle. So we are all unique depending on the worlds that we live in. Then the lighter green circle is our internal factors or factors that have been sort of forced or we grow into them. So I think of myself, I am white, I am cisgendered, I am educated now, I have a good salary, I also come from a farm, so I never forget my rural roots. But because of who I am, I have always been told I matter. You know, I've been told that my voice matters, my opinion is sought after. But that's not always with who we have as students. I have students who are newcomers. I have students who are Indigenous, who are scared of the system, as they rightly should be, because as nurses, as educators, as people, we have and we share our values through these isms. So sometimes people are discriminated against. Some people who have neurodiversity are told that they don't matter because they're not able to provide contributions to society. So our relationships with not only our inherent factors such as age, ethnicity, perhaps some disabilities, but who we are as a society will tell and share with that person whether they are deemed valuable or not. So this is one way of looking at power, privilege, and oppression and unpacking that in the classroom. One of the things that has breaks my heart sometimes is when I teach first year now, but I've taught all across our undergraduate program, is when I hear in fourth year, I had a group of students who were first generation Filipinos, and they said this was the first time they actually felt heard, seen, and valued in the classroom. As nursing faculty, sometimes we have these ideas about who is a good student, what does a good student look like? And we could sometimes set our students up for failure instead of taking a step back and asking that question, how do I set you up for success? So understanding who we are and all of those influences critical, whether you're a nurse educator or a clinician, because we have a lot of work to do in our profession. Next slide, please. So person-centered care, student-centered care is important, but we have to look at the system. So right now, when we look at the system, the world we live in, we have EDI, equity, diversity, and inclusion. So we can start to see where health inequities are, other social inequities are, and we can start to address that. So students who perhaps struggle with some cognitive processes in class, at my university, they are taken out of the classroom if they meet some of the requirements, and they are able to write their exam in another place that is proctored. So instead of taking 1 hour for exam, sometimes they are given 2 hours. So this is a way to empower by recognizing their own uniqueness. And nursing is fundamentally relational. So if we don't understand ourselves and our own social location or the other, then we don't understand how that system has influenced their life choices. Again, some challenges. It's just another layer. So nurses, whether faculty are burnt out, there's a nursing shortage all around the world. We're working more with less resources. People may see it as another task. Why do I have to ask my patient about, some of the influences in their world? Why can't I just do the urinary catheter? Or why do I need to understand that, one of my students was in a Syrian refugee camp prior to coming? I should just focus on her ability or their ability to perform in the classroom. It also needs a paradigm shift. One of the things that I have been working on, and I'm hoping successful, I see a couple of my former students on the call, is giving up control of the classroom. It's not my classroom, it's our classroom. And that requires a paradigm shift. And perhaps because I'm later in my career, I can do that. And I think growing through caring science has helped. But learning experiences are shared experiences. I, as a faculty member, should be learning just as much as the students. But that requires that paradigm shift to create a different type of learning experience. And the world needs to be integrated. So you need an understanding as a faculty member, not just about nursing education, but about the world we live in, about human rights, about climate change, about many different things. So it can be very taxing about thinking about all the things that we actually need to know, but still focusing on what needs to be done. So the next 3 slides are more about concepts. So ecological determinants of health. I have some colleagues at the university I work on that this is part of their scholarship. It certainly has not been part of mine. It is something that I realize now how important it is. So when you think about ecological determinants of health, they're the human factors that drive changes in our ecosystem. They are functioning, population growth, urbanization, economic growth. So when we think about urbanization, we think about maybe gentrification, thinking about cleaning up downtown areas so we can, have more profits, people coming in, spending more at the shops. But you have to take a step back and think somebody else is coming into that place, creating perhaps a new home, but we are displacing people. So oftentimes areas that perhaps are lower socioeconomic, they house people. People go there because that's what they can afford based on their salary or their social assistance. So when we gentrificate a neighborhood, we are displacing individuals. So now people may be houseless, people may be living in their cars, and we know that those circumstances affect their ability to make healthy choices. We have population growth. As our numbers increase, we must support more people. So there's going to be more vehicles. Then we're going to have more emissions. Energy costs are going to increase. There's going to be noise and air pollution. These all lead to health issues. I live close to a refinery. So I'm from Alberta, which is kind of like the Texas of the North. So we have a lot of oil refineries. We have the highest asthma rate in Canada out in that particular city. So we have to think about how we treat the planet and how that's affecting health. And then I think finally, socioeconomic. We live in a very disposable society. I'm trying to be better with recycling. Do I really need extra clothes? We know that there are clothing dumps in the world, and oftentimes they are in countries that are really struggling socially. The other thing is that there are 5 ocean garbage dumps. The biggest one is between Western North America and Hawaii. This garbage dump full of plastic and everything that we don't use is bigger than the state of Texas. So now we are killing fish. I love fish. Fish is a really good protein. But in our pursuit for capitalism and consumerism, we are widening that gap between people who can still afford. And right now, economically, across the globe, we are all suffering. Energy costs are going up, fruit, vegetables, protein, plant-based. So we are widening that gap of people who can afford to make perhaps better health choices and those who aren't. And we need to address that as nurses. There is no place in any of our codes of ethics that talks about putting in a catheter safely. It talks about social justice. And this is one way that we need to think about how we are upholding our social mandate. Next slide, please. So structural determinants of health, there's been a lot of work done out of British Columbia. And this is a way to move beyond the social determinants of health. So a lot of the isms are invisible. So discrimination sometimes is invisible, ableism, sexism, unless we hear people. But even though it's invisible, it lives physically, emotionally, spiritually in those people's bodies who have had those experiences targeted towards them. Yes, and ageism. I see Kathleen just put something up. So when we think about our power relationships with our students, we have to understand where they come from, understand if they came from a place where, it was not good to challenge the system. It was not to ask questions. A lot of our clinical tools, sometimes we reward students when they ask questions. We see that they are engaged, that they're wanting to know more, they're curious. But for some people, that may not be how they grew up. They might see that as a challenge. They might see it as disrespectful. So understanding power, privilege, and oppression as a nurse, whether a faculty member or a clinician, is really important. As I said before, we have narratives in nursing education about who is a good student, what they look like, how they act. And we need to start to unpack these ideas about who matters, who is of value, and perhaps who shouldn't get care or shouldn't be allowed in nursing education. We have laws and legislations that really enforce some of these isms. And we need to have difficult conversations about these isms. And because if we don't have a conversations, we are complacent, but we're also complicit. So being not discriminatory isn't good enough. It means you're standing by and letting it happen. We need to shift to anti-racism, anti-ableism, anti-sexism. And as I get older, I'm starting to feel ageism. So we need to focus on anti-ageism as well. We need to shift and wade into being uncomfortable. It's not comfortable for me to talk about my white settler privilege. I'd rather not talk about it, but it's also the only way that I'm going to grow as an individual and as an educator. As an educator, I need to role model this. We need to figure out that it's not a bad thing to be uncomfortable. It's not a bad thing to disagree with somebody's perspective. It does really help us grow, and we need to role model this for our students. Next slide, please. So this graphic has been really a paradigm shift for me because I went to school in the late 80s. I did a diploma before I went on many times getting in debt going back to school. But I think when I think back to the 80s when I did my diploma, it was sort of, what's wrong with this person? Like, why are they here? And that really sets a notion of kind of shaming and blaming them for, being in the hospital with, a coronary event. I came from an adult cardiology. So when we think about trauma and violence care, it's health care that's accessible and safe for people who are impacted by trauma and violence. So intimate partner violence, child, adult abuse, bullying, dating, and stranger violence, which often leaves them powerless or helpless. Not always, but many times this is rooted in discrimination. So students need to understand structural violence towards people and perhaps violence which they have been a recipient of. So in Alberta and the province next to me, British Columbia, we have a large Indigenous population. Many people who are Indigenous do not seek healthcare until it is quite late in their health trajectory. So there have been two large reports that have come out. The one in Alberta looked at racism in emergency departments. And one of the individuals who commented, who was a white physician, he basically said, you know what, they need to get over it. It's happened in the past. I'm tired of hearing this narrative. In British Columbia, there were people, all employment categories, so physicians, nurses, OTs, PTs, and they actually played a drinking game. So every time an Indigenous person showed up in the emergency department, they tried to guess their blood alcohol level. So when we think about how people have experienced trauma and violence, you can see how that is a barrier to accessing care. We also have those barriers in nursing education, and we need to unpack them and figure out, perhaps why is the student struggling? I had a student who, was kind of perpetually late for clinical. So again, that was part of the clinical tool that, she wasn't being responsible. But we sat down and had a conversation. She was a single parent. The daycare did not open up until 6:30, and sometimes she missed her bus connection. So we worked with her, the staff, myself, and she listened to the tape report and she provided exceptional care. So instead of just saying she's not responsible, trying to figure out what is going on, what is their story, what is their narrative. Next slide, please. So about 8 years ago, I stumbled across this Cynefin framework. So Cynefin is a Welsh term. It talks about a place of multiple belongings. So it really fit with that intersectionality piece. It's a business model. But what I want to point out is it's a sense-making model. I think as nurses who like things in a little box and probably nicely wrapped and with a bow on them, we like to make decisions quickly, check it off. I'm a list maker, but we need to take a step back and think about, what don't I know? How do I make sense of what's going on in this situation? So when you look at this diagram, there are 4 domains listed, but there's also another domain in the middle as well as a cliff. So best practice is where we're mostly comfortable with. I think that's been drilled into us ad nauseum. And this is all of those protocols. It's the models. It's about decision making. So we know that there is usually one cause, and we can predict with pretty good certainty that there's going to be one outcome. But when we know about life is that life is messy, it's ambiguous, so best practice might not be best practice. Sometimes we need to move into the next domain, which is good practice. This is where something has happened and there might be multiple causes or effects that are coming out of this situation. As a nursing faculty or as a nurse, I might just say, you know what, I don't know what's going on. So I reach out to others. So in that, I might reach out to people who are more seasoned than I, who have more experience, or I might reach out to other healthcare professionals, interdisciplinary work, or intersectoral work. So we look for others, experts, to help us understand the situation. Complex means that we don't understand the situation until after it's happened. This is a good place for probing, asking questions, gathering multiple perspectives. We are all different individuals. We're all going to have a unique perspective. And with that, sometimes comes emergent practice, starting to do things a little bit differently. Novel practice is chaotic. So this is what happened with COVID. We had to stabilize the situation. In nursing education, we pivoted very quickly, those universities who taught only in person. So we have to stabilize, then we can take a step back. In the middle is called disorder. Oftentimes we don't even know where to start. So we get paralyzed, but once we become unparalyzed, we move to best practice because that's what we're familiar with. Even if it's a situation that doesn't fit there, that's where we go. Between best practice and the gray area, the gray diamond, is a place called the cliff of complacency. And that's when we start to believe that best practice is the only way forward. That as practitioners, whether it's nurse educators, clinicians, we know best, and we don't necessarily take into consideration the patient's or the student's preferences or perspectives. So I wanted to provide next slide, please, Megan. I wanted to provide a case study. And this case study is something that a former student who's now a graduate had shared with me. So I am going to read it. So you are a recent grad working in an emergency department situated in a rural community which is close to an Indigenous reserve. You've just admitted a 3-year-old girl with a suspected urinary tract infection. She's accompanied by her mother. She is crying, has a fever of 39.6 Celsius, is listless, and appears to be in significant discomfort. So I'm going to use this case study and work through the Cynefin framework as a way to demonstrate how I've used this in my fourth year class to really open up some of these conversations and move us beyond just thinking about best practice. So Megan has a poll and has some questions. So if you can respond to the poll, what healthcare orders would you anticipate? So that lovely NCLEX, select all that apply. Okay, so this could be very challenging, but one of the great things about it, so I would choose A, B, and C, and we'll talk a little bit about that, is that you don't actually have to guess. You know, there's protocols. This protocol is from Australia. So, you know, the girl is 3. So you look at infants and children, you work your way down. So it says considered lumbar puncture. So you might consider it. I did say A, B, and C, but it opens up an opportunity for students as well as faculty to introduce different protocols that they might see in practice. Next slide, please. So part 2, following your initial assessment and health history, you look at her health record. You note she has had monthly trips to this emergency department with urinary tract infections over the last year. Next slide, please, and release the poll. So, you know, again, there isn't a really clear answer. So you have all put different comments in. Certainly a pediatric consult. So if you remember this domain is about asking others for assistance. So perhaps a pediatric consult, you know, why is this young girl getting monthly urinary tract infections? Herbal remedies might be a good one, but it's not about, herbal remedies is kind of an outcome. Really complicated domain is requesting assistance outside of your own practice. A department chart review. So, you know, maybe this child is not the only one who is coming back for repeat visits. Indwelling urinary catheter. Again, it's not about sort of what you would be doing is asking people. So A and C would be the right answers, but again, because there is no one right answer in good practice, you could use this to explore with the students, you know, why did you choose herbal remedies? And they may say, well, she's Indigenous, and perhaps, you know, that there are other remedies outside of antibiotics, which we know probably are being overused. And then, you know, having some comments about the urinary catheter. Next slide, please. So you overhear other nurses making discriminatory comments about the mother's ethnicity, socioeconomic condition, and single parent status. The child and her mother are Indigenous. The mother works night shifts for minimum wage. The mother dropped out of high school when she became pregnant with her daughter. She was disowned by her family of origin, and the father is not part of their lives. They live in subsidized housing and use the food bank to supplement her wages. You can release the poll. So people chose all of them. So the one that I chose as the right answer is C, creating a forum. So a complex domain is understood retrospectively. So the importance of hearing everyone's voice, including the patient and the family or the student, is vital. Multiple perspectives enhance understanding, recognizing that rarely there is one right answer, except on the NCLEX or on our students' exams. And as humans, we live in gray areas or ambiguous places. We set students up for failure when we say there is only one way of doing a skill. All nurses should adapt to their surroundings. What is sterile in hospitals is often clean technique in community settings. We need students to think, not just to respond. Creativity should be encouraged. But this takes self-confidence in your own value as a nurse educator to loosen some of that control, to share those experiences. I utilize a caring science philosophy blended with pedagogy for the courses I teach. Pedagogy is about self-determined learning as a way to evaluate student engagement. It helps build on capacity and capability to be adaptable to the complexities of their workplace. So the reason why I thought C is the best answer is that we all have zero tolerance policies that are very rarely enforced. The nurse manager might be part of the problem, and optional educational in-services on cultural safety and humility aren't really an answer. We have yearly mandatory CPR and fire and WMIS. We need to hold people accountable for cultural safety and humility. So creating a forum to help understand everyone's perspective would be the best fit for this complex domain and emergent practice. Next slide, please. The pediatrician notes significant scarring of the child's vaginal walls. Further interdisciplinary teams are consulted. A social worker and a child therapist work with the young girl and discover ongoing rape by the boyfriend. When questioned, the mother states she relies on paid caregivers when not in a relationship. Her current boyfriend of 1 year has offered to care for her daughter. She readily accepts the offer as she does not have to pay for the care and trusts him. When provided the findings from the healthcare professional, the mother is shocked and then becomes inconsolable, repeating, "What have I done?" Next slide. So in this poll, I would like you to put the actions in order. So the right order is A, responding to the fever and implementing healthcare orders. So remember, chaos is always about trying to stabilize the system. So although this horrific incident has now been brought forward, the child's physical safety needs to be addressed. So her fever is very high. We don't want her to have any febrile seizures. We don't want it to get septic. So we must respond to what's in front of us, what is at most risk. So that is that chaos domain. Then we may want to support the mother through the admission. Many people may shame and blame her, like, how did you not know? This is your daughter. But I would challenge any of us to predict some of the things that have happened in our lives that have caught us off guard. And we need to be kind and compassionate to individuals. You know, she had a lower paying job. She trusted her boyfriend. So we need to help her, not shame and blame her. So we need to respond compassionately. When I worked in adult cardiology, I did not even know there was something called adverse childhood events score. So I didn't have that framework because obviously that was not my population. So as nurse educators, we need to introduce our students to many different types of frameworks and models. The other one that I have been introducing, and I would say most nursing education programs, we tend to focus purely on the physical. It's the easiest to do, it's the easiest that we can see. But what I've started to do now in first year, because I find fourth year is too late, is to look at some spiritual assessment tools. So we have FICA, hope, spirit, because we're not physical beings. We are body, mind, spirit. And if we only focus on one, we're not doing holistic care, and actually we can be dehumanizing individuals. And finally, whether the mother is engaged in her Indigenous culture or not, we have a lot of community partners that we can work with. And as nurse educators, we don't need to, be the expert on LGBTQ health or Indigenous health or migrant health or newcomer health. Think about all the community resources. I have former students, I have other organizations coming and speaking in the classroom because they are the experts. They are more the lived experience. I can only provide a theoretical perspective for students. I can't really share a lived experience, which is so important. That's when we engage with other people's stories, that begins that paradigm shift. It begins that paradigm shift from the heart. Next slide. So how do we future-proof nursing education? So going back to our professional mandate of what is important. So we need to prepare safe, competent, ethical, and compassionate nursing students. I think we're doing a great job with knowledge and skills. What's missing, because we sometimes don't have enough time because we have an additive curriculum, is attitudes and attributes. So we have students who believe that their social perspective or their social identity should be the only one that matters. So we need to disrupt some of those dominant narratives. We need to challenge respectfully and by providing other perspectives. We need to create some brave spaces for the unknown and for relearning. I grew up in the 1970s, and when I think back to my social studies or my cultural thing, I was told a certain story about Indigenous people in Canada. Some of my upbringing in my religious affiliation, I dare say that I am a Roman Catholic. There's a lot of pain that is associated with that religion that I have had to unlearn. So I am unlearning constantly those stories or those narratives that the institutions, my family, my educators in elementary school and high school have taught me. So I need to role model that uncomfortableness for my students as we start to move forward as a collective. And I can't talk enough about the importance of allyship. So we need to be allies for the people that we are called to care for. And we need to change the story. Equality, I say equality should never occur. We are all unique human beings. We need different things. So we need to move to equity. What do you need? What are your preferences? What are your desires? And we need to address the liberation. What are the fences, those barriers that are preventing people from going to school, that are preventing people from entering the nursing profession, that are preventing our global citizens from accessing health care? So next slide, please. So there are some strategies out there. We're not alone in this. Sigma has a lot of communities of interest. Your local chapter, our local chapter has been doing some annual book clubs, looking at Indigenous health, looking at midwifery, looking at, children who have Down syndrome and parents. There's lots of other organizations. There's the WHO has an anti-racist kit. We have different generations. I love to read. And so I think all students love to read, which they don't. So we have to figure out how we're going to get creative. So thinking about blogs, I show a lot of YouTube videos. I show a lot of films. So we have the National Film Board of Canada. One of my students about a year ago introduced me to this American YouTube site called Soft White Underbelly. And these are lived experiences. They're interviews of people who have been marginalized, who have been told they don't matter. So I also use these YouTube videos in class. One of the most powerful platforms that I have been involved in for the last 2 years was Overdue Reckoning on Racism in Nursing. So Dr. Lucinda Canty is leading this. She is a Black American scholar focused on maternal health. She's supported by Dr. Christine Nariati and Dr. Peggy Chin. And because I'm white and I've been trying to unpack my privilege, not only as a human being, but also as a nurse educator, this platform has given me such great insights into the struggles that many people, faculty member of color, have struggled with, as well as how to create some meaningful learning experiences with my students. I remember what Peggy said when we first started. She goes, "You white nurses need to sit down, be quiet, and listen." And in that moment, I realized how much privilege I had. Next slide, please. Again, we don't really have to reinvent a lot of learning experiences. So there are massive open online courses. I've been using this as an evaluative strategy in my 4th year. So 20% of the students' grade is on a MOOC that they take if they're interested in it. And they can take whatever they want to take. Some students will take Mandarin. I want them to understand how they learn, and I want them to be inspired to continue to learn. So these are 3 sites. The first site, Equip for Health, is a really great site to look at trauma and violence informed care. It's out of British Columbia. Future Learn is out of the UK, and then MOOCs kind of gathers all of the consortiums from around the world. Next slide, please. And last slide. This has been very powerful for me as well. So as I said, I grew up in a religion that really looks at the golden rule. Many religions talk about the golden rule, but O'Connor and Alessandra challenge that notion. So the golden rule says, treat others as you want to be treated. That is very me-centered. It's very narcissistic. It's very ethnocentric. So if I want to treat others as I want to be treated, I'm actually going to cause them a lot of trauma. So they suggest shifting to the platinum rule. So when we treat others as they want to be treated, we recognize the uniqueness of them. We recognize that their journey, where they've been, how far they've come, what they're still struggling with. Then we are treating them with the care that they deserve. So we need to have this in nursing education. I've introduced it in 1st year, and the students pass me in the hallway and they go, "I'm still doing the platinum rule." So I know, and it seems very simplistic, but I think if every human being had the platinum rule, what a beautiful world we would live in. Anyway, that's all I have to say. So I hope you have gathered some insights, and if not, I would love to talk some more about it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Maycott. We do have a few minutes for questions, so please use the Q&A feature to enter any questions that you might want to pose to our presenter. One question that we do have is in regards to looking at future-proofing the profession. What are some tips or tricks you have from your academia standpoint to help students instill intellectual curiosity with these various components of patient care?
Oh, well, that's lots of questions to unpack. I think that one of the things that I've been really embracing lately is the notion of failing safely. I mean, nursing education really needs to create experiences where students can do trial and error. And that's easier to do like in simulation and in lab, because we don't really want them doing trial and error on patients' lives. So I think when they feel supported and nurtured, and that learning experiences are mostly learning with a little bit of evaluation instead of evaluation with a little bit of learning, it changes the students' ability to engage in their learning. I think when I have done that in the classroom, students are more curious. I want to be challenged. I don't always feel comfortable being challenged in the classroom, but I know that that will help me grow. So creating those spaces where that concepts can be disrupted, that people can say, I don't agree with that, so that you can have that dialogue. Because if we shut students down in nursing education, they're going to be shut down in clinical practice. They're going to just focus on the physical, and curiosity helps them to continue to grow. And we want our students to grow. So I'm not sure if that answered the question. There's lots of different pieces, and probably a few more webinars on that, but I found Hudagogy was really instrumental in creating those learning experiences. And I would say I'm very grateful for being grounded in caring sciences for as long as I have, to see the student as a human being.
Thank you for that. And I think sometimes we forget that our students are and our patients are humans, right?
Mhm.
They have a lot of things going on that make the situations very complicated. And it's not just giving them a grade or making sure that they get the right answer on the exam, but rather how can you instill in them the high quality attributes to be professional nurses and care for the person, not just the diagnosis or the disease.
Mhm. And I think just following up for the next question, I think about vulnerability. So I've been a nurse for 35 years. So, I mean, I share with students some of the mistakes I've made, some little, some pretty huge. Thank goodness nobody died. But I think, as faculty, we need to be vulnerable, saying that, we're not perfect, that we make mistakes, and that we are trialing things out, perhaps a different learning experience, and getting student feedback. I mean, lots of things we do for the very first time. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But there's two people in this learning experience, as both the learner and the teacher. And the teacher is both the learner and the teacher, and the student is the learner and the teacher. So I think about vulnerability is an important aspect to have in the classroom as well.
And then what do you think about how we can promote leadership in our students? This individual says it's often not practiced. Students often learn to follow, not lead. And when they start practicing clinically, often they tolerate many stressors, but do not share and lead. How can we improve that as a profession?
So this leadership and followership is not my background. I know some of my colleagues out there who probably would answer a lot better, but I think we need to have those experiences in nursing education. We need to certainly role model. So I am hoping my students who have graduated are disruptors. Some of them will not be, for fear or lack of interest. But I do think that when we get a critical mass, that nurses are the most populous of all the healthcare professionals, yet we still take a back seat. We're not invited to the table. So we need to give them, different learning experiences that get at that political acumen, like what are some strategies that you can both lead and follow, and to think about their nursing practice outside of that clinical practice, right? That there is other things that they can do. They can get involved in voluntary boards. They can be part of board of directors. They can volunteer at soup kitchen. So I think sometimes we're very siloed in thinking about what a nurse does and what ways we can lead. So as you said in my bio, I'm leading and following both in my involvement with Sigma. I've been part of boards of directors for women's shelters. I have been part of, other fund developers. They need nurses. They need their nurses' expertise outside of kind of direct clinical practice. So I think building those experiences into curriculum would be important.
And I just want to read this comment because I think it is very uplifting to hear. So this individual says that they are a new educator, and this is so much of what they want to learn about how to bring it to the nursing education space. So I think that speaks volumes, and we're so glad to have new educators as well as educators that have been in the field for quite some time.
It's trial and error. Things will work, things won't work. I think don't give up on yourself. Reach out to others, build a community. There's things that I've done. I'm just like, now I'm just like, oh, I can't believe I did that. But you know what? We don't know, and we won't grow unless you try things. And so it's a risk.
And there's two comments that I'm going to tie together in regards to students and administrators just focusing on the NCLEX. So one individual says that she teaches a leadership class, but it's seen mostly by the students as a waste of their time because it has no clinical tie-in, and of course, is not directly clinical related to the NCLEX. And then somebody else in the chat stated, it's hard to bring topics like this to the forefront in academia when administrators and students are specifically wanting to know what's on the NCLEX. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Well, in Canada, we've only had the NCLEX since 2015. So there's many of us who struggle with it just because we see it as, it is a snapshot. It's unfortunate when people, I think, are forced or encouraged to teach to the NCLEX because pass rates, I think in the States, are oftentimes tied to accreditation. I think there's some ways around it. You have to be kind of really creative. So you can teach to the NCLEX, but also bring in some of the concepts. But to bring in the concepts means that you need to remove things. So I don't think there's certainly an easy answer. People want to have license, sure, because that's kind of what most nursing programs lead to. But I think getting perhaps some support within the organization that you work at, because there probably will be more people than just yourself who want to perhaps refresh the curriculum and, you know, attend conferences, read, tie into that community of practice at Sigma. There are people out there doing things. We do have NCLEX. There is a strong force within our curriculum of individuals, but there is probably an equally strong force to say that we're not teaching to the NCLEX. It's because students need also to prepare and to study. And we are teaching to graduate a generalist and not just a nurse. We're really trying to graduate a global citizen. So no easy answer. I mean, we struggle with it at our university as well, but there are ways, I think, to try to be creative. So hopefully that answers that question.
Yes, wonderful. Thank you so much. And we are at the end of our time. So I want to go ahead and start closing us out. Thank you so much, Dr. Maycott, for all that you've shared with us. Megan, if you could advance the slides, please. And Dr. Maycott's email is on the screen. So if you did want to connect after the webinar, please feel free to use her email address to continue the discussion. We want to thank you so much for all that you shared with us today. This is great information, and Sigma is grateful that you took the time to share with our audience, and we look forward to hearing more from you in the future. We hope you enjoyed this webinar. As a reminder, 1 week from today, we will email you a link to the email address in which you registered for the webinar so that you can obtain your Nursing Continuing Professional Development Certificate. Be sure to check out Sigma's upcoming webinars, podcasts, and resources to support you and your colleagues at sigmanursing.org. Also, previously recorded webinars are freely available on the Sigma repository. And again, we want to thank our sponsor for this faculty prep webinar series, which was proudly sponsored by Lecturio. Thank you so much and have a wonderful day.